Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Seepersod coming to you from the campus of Binghamton University, and welcome to our program today, The Road Back to Legality in New York. This is a webinar that's part of the Binghamton Learning Network webinar series. About every month, we offer a different program, and this is part of the Alumni Association's lifelong learning offerings. We have so much to share with you all year round. In addition to the webinar series, we have a virtual book club, virtual movie club, the Tier Talk speaker series, and a variety of other ways that you can get involved with the Alumni Association and the university from wherever you are. And I have the Alumni Association website address up on the screen, binghamton.edu/alumni, binghamton.edu/alumni. You can volunteer with us, go to events, come to homecoming, check out the lifelong learning offerings, see a list of alumni authors, blog producers. The alumni newsletter is there, links to the magazine, so much. So could be a show in and of itself to talk about all the things on the website, but we will move on to some other things. But that address is there on the screen. So check it out after the show if you would like. So we'll be taking your questions over the course of the next hour. If you're watching on the microsite or on Facebook, you'll see there's a space to add a comment. And so send us your questions that way. We'll be keeping an eye on the questions during the show, and we'll mix these in wherever possible. The presentation will take about 40 to 45 minutes. We'll have some questions mixed in, and then the end of the show, the last 15 minutes or so, will be the time dedicated solely to your questions. So start now if you would like. This is meant to be fun and interactive, and we picked this because we thought it would be a fun topic. Several years ago, we had a Tier Talk speaker event in Westchester County, New York, on the topic of the evolution of cannabis. And it was a very, very popular program. And certainly a lot has happened with respect to cannabis and state level regulations in the years since we initially had that program. So today's speaker, Neil Kaufman from the class of '81, was part of the panel that we had of 4 speakers as part of that Tier Talks event. And we're bringing him back for today. So just a little bit about his background before we go ahead and bring him onto the screen. He's a managing member of Kaufman McGowan Corporate and Securities Counsel to the State-Legal Cannabis Industry, one of the leading corporate cannabis law firms in the country. Neil is a very, very highly sought after speaker, so we are very fortunate to have him here with us this afternoon. Neil, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the webinar, and we'll go ahead and pass it along to you for what I'm sure will be a super dynamic program.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much. Wait, here come the slides, I think. There we go. Thank you very much, Steve. As you mentioned, we're going to talk today a little bit about the history of cannabis and its long road back to legality in New York State. As Steve also mentioned briefly, I am a proud member of the class of 1981 of SUNY Binghamton, from which I went on to graduate from New York University School of Law. I've been practicing corporate and securities law for a long time and have been actively involved in the cannabis industry for over 8 years. Have participated in over $2 billion of cannabis industry transactions of all types, all around the country, including in New York. And then in addition to running the law firm that Steve mentioned, I'm also the former chairman of a NASDAQ-listed publicly traded technology company and the chairman of the audit committee and a member of the board of trustees of 2 mutual fund families. It's very gratifying to me to share what I've learned about the cannabis industry with fellow Binghamton alumni, especially given that Binghamton is the place that I have so much to thank for with respect to my formative cannabis education. You'll notice throughout the presentation, I will refer to cannabis, which includes both high THC, which is commonly called in the vernacular marijuana, or a lot of other things that we called it back in the day, and also its close genetic cousin, low THC hemp. This is an important distinction that will become clear as we go on, especially because hemp can now be fully legal under United States federal law, while high THC marijuana is not. I would like to review with you some interesting historical information about cannabis that you may not be fully aware of. Cannabis has been in use by human beings for a very long time. There are historical records going back over 10,000 years from ancient cultures, including China, India, Egypt, and Persia, and elsewhere, that refer to the use of cannabis for a variety of medical and industrial purposes. Numerous ancient texts refer to cannabis, including being used for treatments such as rheumatism, menstrual problems, inflammation, cataracts, glaucoma, cancer, leprosy, sexual desire, and as an analgesic treatment for surgeries and other conditions. Even in the Old Testament book of Exodus, cannabis is referred to as cannabosem and was purportedly one of the ingredients contained in the holy anointing oil passed from the God of the Bible to Moses. So it's been in use for a really long time. What a lot of people also don't realize is that cannabis played a key role in the rise from the Middle Ages throughout Western civilization. Places like the Republic of Venice and the British Empire used hemp fabric sails and other hemp-derived products, which played a key role in the beginnings of the industrialization of Europe. It's also interesting to note that in many ways, the United States of America is the country that cannabis built. While George Washington was trying repeatedly and failing repeatedly to breed high THC hemp at Mount Vernon, Martha made the first United States flag from hemp cloth. Thomas Jefferson also grew hemp at Monticello and smoked it as a treatment for his migraine headaches. James Madison is reported to have claimed that what they called in those days sweet hemp gave him insight to write the U.S. Constitution. Beginning in the 1840s, cannabis-based products such as Squire's extract and Tilden's extract became popular medications in America. By 1850, the United States Pharmacopoeia listed cannabis as a treatment for many conditions, including convulsions. Also, by the mid-1800s, hemp had dropped from its previous position as the largest cash crop in colonial America to the third most commonly grown agricultural crop in America, behind only slave economy-driven cotton and tobacco. By the latter half of the 19th century, every pharmaceutical company in America was busy manufacturing cannabis-based cures, including Squibb, Parke-Davis, and Eli Lilly. America's cannabis fad lasted from the mid-1800s till just about the 20th century, but alas, all good things, like our college years in Binghamton, eventually had to end. William Randolph Hearst branded cannabis as marijuana, its Mexican name, to associate it with unpopular Mexican immigrants, and used his chain of newspapers to attack the plant as part of the yellow journalism trend beginning in the late 1800s that you learned about if you were paying attention in your history classes in the lecture hall. The resulting furor began a cascade of state laws banning cannabis, which sadly started right here in New York in 1906, the first place in America to make cannabis illegal. The man most responsible for making cannabis illegal in this country is Harry J. Anslinger. He was an anti-corruption bureaucrat who actually started out pro-cannabis. He was the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the predecessor to the FBI. When alcohol prohibition ended in 1933, he realized that heroin and cocaine alone were not enough to support his department, and he began to aggressively advocate a nationwide ban on cannabis, the evil weed. He authored sensationalist articles that were eagerly published by Hearst's 28 newspapers. Hearst had a vertically integrated business empire and had substantial timber interests that supplied the newsprint for his newspapers. He was concerned that competition from hemp-derived newsprint would compete with his timber interests and was on a mission to destroy the cannabis industry. There are also rumors that the DuPont chemical family, whose company invented nylon, sought to also undermine hemp competition in fabrics by supporting the anti-cannabis wave. Anslinger especially liked to cite the story of Victor Licata, who supposedly massacred his family because he was a marijuana smoker. As it turned out, Licata had a serious mental illness and did not even use cannabis. But those kind of details did not stop Anslinger. He commissioned an expert panel of 30 panelists to evaluate cannabis. 29 of them came back and said, no problem. He discarded those and repeatedly cited the one respondent who supported his position who happened to be biased. So why, you might ask, would an otherwise seemingly upstanding public official act like this? Well, sadly, this is explained in Anslinger's own words. It's hard to even repeat these things that he said in this day and age, right? They're just so outside the realm of anything that any rational person would think, or much less say nowadays. I'm not even going to verbally repeat these slides. You can read them. They're offensive, and it gives you some idea of the moral underpinning of the anti-cannabis crusaders. All of those efforts ultimately prompted Congress to act. The result was the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. The MTA imposed licensing, registration, and stamp tax requirements that effectively, though not technically, made cannabis illegal. Anslinger drafted the law in secret. There were few congressional hearings held, and many congressmen knew little about the statute. They hadn't even read the bill. Do any of these tactics sound familiar to modern politics? This is not the first time we've seen it. The American Medical Association, the New York Academy of Medicine, and most doctors opposed the Marijuana Tax Act, but nothing was going to stop Anslinger and his band of fools. Anslinger continued his anti-cannabis campaign straight through the 1950s. He was kept on in his position even through the Kennedy administration, and he constantly encouraged Congress to impose ever stricter sentences and restrictions on marijuana. Now the story gets interesting. In 1969, the United States Supreme Court ruled in a case called Leary v. United States, brought by, yes, that Timothy Leary, the former Harvard professor known for his involvement with LSD, that struck down the Marijuana Tax Act as unconstitutionally abridging the Fifth Amendment rights of doctors. So for a very brief period in 1969 to 1970, cannabis was actually fully legal in this country, but that reprieve did not last long. The Nixon administration in 1970 passed the Controlled Substances Act, which listed cannabis in Schedule 1, along with heroin and LSD. Now, there had been widespread doubts about the accuracy of this scheduling and how bad cannabis really was. So it was put in Schedule 1 only temporarily and was subject to further research to be conducted by what became known as the Schaefer Commission on Marijuana Drug Abuse, led by former Pennsylvania Governor, law and order aficionado Schaefer himself. So interestingly, the Schaefer Commission came back and reported that essentially cannabis was for the most part harmless. The screen shows you a summary of some of their findings. Bottom line, they said it should not be criminal. Marijuana users didn't seem to be adversely affected. No aggressive behavior was noted from cannabis users. Actually, the opposite was found. Surprise, surprise. But Nixon, when he saw the Schaefer Commission report, flipped out, rejected it, and manipulated its findings. That left cannabis stuck in Schedule 1, where it remains to this day, all these years later. The really sad part about all this is the reason why Nixon insisted on putting and leaving cannabis in Schedule 1. You can see this quote from former Nixon aide John Ehrlichman of Watergate fame. You know what this was really all about. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. In the Watergate tapes, Nixon is heard to be blaming it all on Jewish psychiatrists out to get him. Amazing. Despite all that, since the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, the federal government itself has often recognized the benefits of cannabis, including by subsidizing cannabis patient treatment for at least 15 patients, filing a 1999 patent application admitting that cannabinoids are good neuroprotectants, and in 1988, a DEA administrative law judge ruled that cannabis constitutes a treatment for several medical conditions and is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. In 1996, largely through the efforts of gay rights activists fighting the AIDS epidemic, California became the first state to legalize medical cannabis. Currently, 37 states have legalized cannabis for medical use. And newsflash update to the slide, last night, 2 more states voted to approve recreational cannabis. And now there are 21 states that have legalized recreational cannabis use. All but 2 states permit CBD, which is a low THC, a no THC product, which can be derived from low THC hemp. Cannabis legalization is also spreading worldwide. Over 73% of Americans live in states that permit cannabis, but it is still illegal under US federal law. 49 countries have legalized medical cannabis, and 7 countries have legalized recreational cannabis in some capacity. Of those 7 countries, 2 of them have operational sales at the national level, including, of course, our northern neighbor, Canada, and the other one is Uruguay. Ultimately, the best solution to the cannabis problem legally is going to depend on Congress, as scary a thought as that may be. The Biden administration is reconsidering the Schedule 1 status of cannabis, but that doesn't really solve the problem, because if you reschedule cannabis down to Schedule 2 or lower, cannabis will then be subject to FDA regulation just like any other drug product. Medical cannabis will be a real problem because any substance that makes medical claims is defined as a drug and would be required to be subject to FDA approval. Cannabis has a multitude of strains and chemical permutation. There's no one chemical formulation that is botanically repeatable that really could be subject to FDA approval. And it costs $100 million or so to get FDA approval. There's nobody out there ready to finance, an FDA approval process for a genetically diverse plant such as cannabis. As a result, if cannabis were rescheduled, the FDA might close down all state legal medical cannabis companies. They might almost have to. So really the only solution is for Congress to enact a new regulatory scheme for this special plant, similar to what it did for dietary supplements and tobacco. Until then, since 2014, Congress has passed annual riders to federal budget bills which prohibit the Department of Justice from using any funds to prosecute defendants operating in compliance with state medical marijuana laws. Federal courts have relied on this to stop prosecutions of state-compliant medical cannabis companies, and this has provided temporary protection to that part of the industry, but not the rapidly growing recreational market. In the current environment, where over 70% of the American public is pro-cannabis, U.S. attorneys have been looking the other way and generally not aggressively prosecuting cannabis offenses, consistent with the Department of Justice guidelines to U.S. attorneys. Interestingly, in 2018, Congress passed a farm bill that made hemp and all hemp-derived products in the United States legal under U.S. federal law if they're grown under an approved state hemp program by a licensed grower and produced in a manner consistent with the Farm Bill and the federal and state regulations under the Farm Bill. So as a result, hemp products, which have less than 0.3% THC, can be fully federally legal. This is a major change in the industry. This is why you see CBD shops springing up all around the country. As long as those CBD and other cannabinoid products are derived from low THC hemp produced in accordance with the regulations complying with the 2018 Farm Bill, they are fully federally legal. Interestingly, though, cannabinoids, including that derived from hemp, that are produced in any other setting, such as by state law compliant cannabis companies, remain illegal under federal law. So you could have the same exact product. If it's derived from hemp that's grown in compliance with the 2018 Farm Bill, it can be legal. But that same product, if it's derived from a state legal cannabis program that does not comply with the restrictions under the 2018 Farm Bill, that product can be illegal. So when you buy CBD and other hemp spectrum products, you need to actually be able to determine how they were produced to determine whether that product is actually legal, which is, that's the challenge for the operators in that industry, some of whom are not always the most careful about it. So let's focus a little bit on New York State. As I mentioned earlier, sadly, the first state to make cannabis illegal. In 2015, New York passed the Compassionate Care Act, which made it the 24th state to legalize medical marijuana. Pursuant to that statute, there were initially five registered organizations permitted to sell medical marijuana. That was subsequently expanded to 10. Those companies are all required to be fully vertically integrated. They're required to grow the plant, harvest it. If they're going to create extracted products, they need to extract it themselves, package it themselves, and sell it in their own dispensaries. Full vertical integration. So this New York medical program was fundamentally very restrictive and fairly unsuccessful. And even though it's since been expanded, it also has left complications for the recreational market. Keep in mind, again, the New York medical program went all the way to one end of the spectrum, mandating full vertical integration by all market participants. Since then, in 2019, New York decriminalized possession of and smoking of up to 2 ounces of cannabis. And then in 2021, when Andrew Cuomo was desperately seeking a political win in the midst of his downfall, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in Albany pushed through the Marijuana Regulation and Tax Act, which finally legalized recreational cannabis in New York. New York was the 15th state to legalize recreational cannabis, and the statute had a strong emphasis on social equity and righting the wrongs that resulted from the Nixon-Rockefeller war on drugs. Over 100,000 marijuana convictions were suppressed, and some of them were permanently expunged. In addition, 150 previously convicted cannabis offenders are being afforded the opportunity to obtain the first retail licenses. Their stores are to be supplied by New York's previously licensed hemp cultivators, over 200 of which received conditional cannabis cultivation licenses. Those Cultivators are right now, as we speak, harvesting their crop and getting those crops ready for the first wave of legal dispensaries that are hoped to be open before the end of the year and shortly thereafter. New York also intends to provide a $200 million public-private fund for social equity applicants opening the retail dispensaries in New York, where they're going to loan up to $1 million to each of them on a non-recourse basis at 8% interest to fund the building of their stores. That fund has had some problems. We're not quite sure how that's going to play out, but that was the plan at least. New York has given local jurisdictions the ability to decide whether to allow cannabis retail stores and consumption lounges to operate within their local jurisdictions. They had until December 31, 2021 to opt out. Municipalities that did opt out by that deadline are allowed to opt in at any time or hold a referendum at any time to rescind their opting out. If you didn't opt out by then, you effectively opted in and can no longer ban retail cannabis establishments. It's currently 763 out of 1,520 New York State municipalities have opted out of retail dispensaries, and 882 have opted out of consumption lounges. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the New York recreational market and the regulatory process. We still do not have a full set of regulations. Those are proposed regulations are expected to drop by the end of this year. The market should be up and running sometime in 2023. So remember how I said the New York medical cannabis market was required to be vertically integrated? Well, now in the recreational market, the legislature has completely banned vertical integration, except for the existing medical registered organizations who are allowed to continue to be vertically integrated. All other recreational market participants are not allowed to be vertically integrated. The license types are divided into two tiers, the retail tier and the supply tier, which includes cultivation, processing, which means extraction of oil and turning it into edibles and vapes and other products, and distribution. No vertical integration is permitted at all between the tiers. So anyone that owns a financial interest in a retail license is barred from having any financial interest in the supply tier licenses and vice versa. Retail license holders will be allowed to have up to 3 locations, and they will be automatically allowed to deliver. Interestingly, even if a local municipality opted out of retail, they're not allowed to prohibit delivery in their jurisdiction. If you're not a retail licensee, you need to get a separate delivery license if you're going to deliver. And licensees are limited to have, well, applicants are limited to having a financial interest in only one delivery license. Vertical integration is also severely limited within the supply tier. If a licensee of one type of a supply tier license would like to obtain either of the other types, then they can only use their own products. So if you're a distributor and you have an interest in a cultivator or a processor, you will then only be allowed to distribute the products of that cultivator or processor, which severely limits your business and makes the business impractical. You can also only have a direct or beneficial financial interest in one cultivator's license, although a single cultivator's license can cover multiple locations. An investor can own any interest in any number of distributor licenses. Licensed distributors, like I said, that have a direct or indirect interest in a cultivator or processor only are allowed to distribute those products. No processor can hold more than one processor license, but again, can operate at multiple locations. But you can only own a majority interest in one processor license. There's also a micro business category that allows for vertical integration at a reduced scale, but you can only cultivate, process, distribute, deliver, and dispense your own product, although you can also sell your product to other retailers. The exact specifics of the micro business licenses have yet to be promulgated by the Office of Cannabis Management, which regulates the industry.
Neil, if you
So,
don't mind, I just want to jump in with a bit of housekeeping before we go to the next slide and a question. So if you have questions, send them in through the comment box on the microsite and on Facebook, or you can email them to me at scpers@binghamton.edu, and I'll put this graphic again up during the webinar. So if you didn't get a chance to jot it down, I'll leave it up a few more seconds, but this gives you a chance to see it later. But in thinking about what you just showed in the previous slide or two and the changes in New York and in other states where now this is being legalized for dispensaries and retail sales, what do you feel is the driving force behind that? To me, it feels an awful lot like sports betting, and you see play FanDuel, play DraftKings. It's going to be starting up in this state and X date, and it's been here in New York for a while, and you feel like it feels like the primary motivation is they can tax it. They can tax the winnings and they can tax the sales. So, and so
well, yes.
if they can tax it, they will. So do you feel that that's the primary motivator, or is it really more, I mean, I'm sure the social equity and not wanting to burden the courts with what they feel are lower level violations of the law is certainly motivator as well, but want to get your perspective on that.
Well, I think those are the two primary motivating factors for the politicians. They clearly like the tax revenues, they plug budget deficits, and they allow for funding a lot of pet projects. Some of that is written into the statute. Many legislators, especially in New York, are also driven by significant social equity concerns. And, that's one of the powerful features of the New York statute is its orientation towards social equity. New York is trying to have half of their licenses go to social equity applicants. The challenge that has created, Steve, just to sort of continue down the path of the answer to your question in a broader sense, is that the legislature had it in their head that we've got this new cannabis industry, and we want this to be available to all of these equity participants, and so we don't want the big moneyed interests coming in and dominating the industry. So they tried to come up with a structure that would essentially turn the New York cannabis industry into a bunch of mom and pop businesses. And what they failed to properly consider, in my view, is that cannabis is a very capital intensive industry. People think you just open a cannabis business and print money. There are a lot of challenges, which we'll go through in the next few minutes, describing a little bit of. And it's very, very difficult to run a profitable cannabis business, especially at a small scale. And by trying to impose this mom and pop equity driven structure, my concern is that the legislation may hamstring the development of the New York industry and doom a lot of these entrants into the cannabis industry in New York to failure, despite all the best of intentions. So I hope that answers your question. Nationwide, the cannabis industry has exploded. Keep in mind, the cannabis industry worldwide is $300 billion. It's just that most of that's in the black market. Now, in the legal part alone, the state legal part of the U.S. market, we've seen about $30 billion of revenues in 2021, more in 2022, projected to increase to over $60 billion by 2026. And that, of course, has generated billions of dollars of state tax revenues, and also generated almost $500,000, 500,000 jobs rather, in the United States. And a lot of these are high paying jobs available to people that otherwise would be working at Walmart or at other minimum wage jobs. And that is the unsung story of this industry that we're hopeful will persuade Congress to act, because now, let's face it, the industry in California and Colorado, the whole West Coast, and now increasingly the East Coast has developed or is developing. It's the red states that are dragging behind, and that will be the next wave to legalize cannabis. But the capital markets have dried up, and there's going to be very little investment capital to generate these high-paying jobs in some of these states that really need them badly. And we're hoping that will motivate Congress to make some changes. But 500,000 jobs is nothing to sneeze at in this country. The industry has been rapidly evolving and professionalizing. Flower is still king. Still more than 50% of cannabis products sold in this country is flower. But vape oils and edibles are growing significantly. Vape is, I think, the second largest category, 20 or 30% of the market. Edibles are very popular with a certain segment of the market, and especially gummies and chocolates are very popular aspects of that segment of the market. But the market still has a lot of challenges.
So I'm sorry, I just wanted to follow up on something. When you're talking about the social equity applicants,
Yes.
is that basically what's referred to in other spaces as a minority and women business-owned enterprise, or is that meant to just kind of say we're referring to something other than these big box companies that want to just open up chains of stores across the state?
No, it doesn't count if you're a white guy that wants to open a store. You're not equity. But it's a little broader than that. Social equity in New York is a wide variety of minorities, including African Americans, Native Americans, South Asians, Pacific Islanders, military veterans, and victims of the war on drugs who have some type of cannabis-related conviction in their record. And it also includes women. So when they say they want to give half of the licenses to equity applicants, well, by my rough math, equity applicants include about 75% of the population, because it's every female plus every one of those other minority groups. So I don't know how meaningful those numbers are. It sounds good in a soundbite, but it's a pretty broad section of the population.
Got a couple of questions that have come through the chat. One is from Debbie, who asked, can we get a copy of your slides after? I'll share that this is being recorded and will be made available on the Facebook page, facebook.com/Binghamton alum, and on the microsite, but I'm sure getting the slides around won't be a problem. We'll put up Neil's contact information at the end of the program and can take care of it that way. This question from Meredith: why are the jobs high paying for persons who would otherwise work in low paying retail jobs, and what kinds of jobs are they?
Well, that depends on the type of licensee it is, right? So for example, at a retail level, someone that might be otherwise working, at a low paying retail job, if they're a bud tender, they're going to have to develop some learning and expertise, and those folks are critical in the sales process. And generally, they don't make minimum wage; they make more than that. There are all kinds of security and other positions, and generally they pay more than other retail positions. In the cultivation aspect of the business, you've got serious horticulturalists and other people that have a lot of knowledge and expertise. I mean, this is not an easy crop to grow consistently at high levels. We say in the industry, it's very easy to grow shitty weed. It's very difficult to consistently grow high grade cannabis that can command premium prices. And the people that are involved in that process, they don't get paid minimum wage. Those are six-figure jobs in many cases. All through the chain of distribution and production, the people that are extracting the oils and producing the infused products, these are skilled positions. It's not rocket science. You can learn it, but once you learn it, it's not a minimum wage job anymore. I hope that, answers that question. That said, with those wage rates is one of the constraints on cannabis businesses being able to operate successfully. They have others like the interstate commerce restrictions. The inability to ship product interstate means you need to rebuild infrastructure on a state-by-state basis that eliminates all the economies of scales that other industries benefit from. There are severe advertising restrictions which prohibit branding, and is one of the reasons why we see very few national or regional brands yet to emerge in the industry. There's still a lack of banking services in some states, and there's almost a complete lack of credit card processing services to cannabis companies. Internal Revenue Code Section 280E imposes severe tax burdens on cannabis companies. It says that any business engaged in the distribution of illegal drugs is not allowed to deduct their operating business expenses, only their cost of goods sold. That creates an enormous tax burden on cannabis businesses, especially at the retail and distribution level. That makes it all that much harder to operate your cannabis business successfully. And then on top of all that, for the last couple of years, we've seen collapsing prices as so much has been invested in the infrastructure in the states where cannabis is legal. Supply has outstripped demand, and prices have collapsed, which has put tremendous pressure on cannabis businesses. Interestingly, over the years, with the somewhat of the lack of financing options, many cannabis companies have accessed the public markets, especially in Canada, to raise growth capital. There are over 400 publicly traded cannabis companies. 29 of them are tracked in the United States Marijuana Index. 40 of them are listed on a U.S. exchange, despite hostility from NASDAQ and FINRA. There are many cannabis companies traded in Canada, even those that operate in the U.S. Cannabis investments have gone through several peaks and troughs, as you can see from the chart there on the upper right. A lot of companies that have gone public in cannabis are not, well, you've got a lot of the top companies and a lot of the not so top companies. So if you want to invest in a cannabis company, you need to carefully look into that particular company and its attributes. You shouldn't just assume that any cannabis company will be successful. Many of them are not. A lot of them have sort of the typical problems that small public companies run into with lack of staff and management and internal controls. Some of them have mismanaged their financials and their books and records. So you need to carefully look at each company. There was a real boom in cannabis stocks a few years ago. Some of the big companies went public and did very well. But, Canopy Growth, for example, was trading below its initial IPO listing price. Curaleaf stock price has fallen to a third of its peak in 2021. Cronos is worth less than a fifth of what it was in 2019. Cresco Labs went public at 48 and is now 435, a 90% decline. Hexo has declined from $33 in May of 2019 to 18 cents. Columbia Care, which is one of the largest New York registered organizations, has fallen sharply from its IPO price of $7.20 to $2.30 currently. MedMen, another New York operator, dropped from $7 to 4 cents. So you have to be careful with a lot of these companies. A lot of them, one would say, are primed for a rebound, especially if we see some good news out of Washington. And when we do eventually have federal legality, I think we all expect the values of cannabis companies to pop, but we really don't know when that is going to be. So this has been a story thousands of years in the making, distorted for the last 100+ years by the anti-cannabis craze. But cannabis has a long history, and in emerging from its recent black market doldrums, we've seen exponential growth in the state legal cannabis industry. With increasing legal acceptance, more professional management coming into cannabis companies, and intermittently robust investor interest, we all expect to see the continued rapid maturation of an eventually profitable industry, bringing economic growth, good investment opportunities, many high-paying jobs, and most importantly, enormous health benefits to the American people at the end of this long and winding road. So you can see my contact information up there. Anybody that would like to reach out to me, I'm happy to send you a copy of the deck, answer any questions you may have. If anyone has any other questions they would like to put in the chat, that's fine also. Steve, whatever, wherever you want to go from here.
Sure, I'll put the graphic at the bottom with your email address. I think this may be in this typeface a little bit easier for people to read, and certainly if you have any questions or want to get the slide deck or just talk to Neil after the program, he's certainly very willing and is donating his time to be here with us today, and a very sought after speaker. It sounded like your phone was ringing a couple of
So
times
my
during the
apologies.
talk, so no, not at all. So just saying that, it's probably just goes to show how in demand you are, that it's hard to pull away for about an hour or so. We're certainly glad you're with us. So definitely get these questions in by email. I'll put this up just for a couple of seconds. So that way, if you want to send something in through the chat or by email, that's fine. We have a little bit more than 10 minutes to go before we would really need to start wrapping up. So plenty of time still left to work with. And so Neil, I was thinking about a trip I took over the summer. I went to Springfield, Massachusetts, and as soon as you're on 90 and you get into Massachusetts, here come all the billboards. It seemed like every one of them was for a cannabis dispensary of one sort or another. And so, they've been up for a while. New York's chapter of the story is sort of yet to begin. What states from your observations have really done the best at this, and however that's defined to be?
Well, I think that depends on your perspective. Massachusetts is, not generally considered to have been a particularly successful rollout. It took them a very long time. Um, their equity program, they tried, but, it hasn't worked particularly well. The Massachusetts stores have benefited tremendously from their proximity to, New York and Connecticut, populous states where residents can go right over the border, and purchase, and then violate federal law by crossing back over state lines with their products. So, views differ. I'm a fan, personally, of the states that have let the markets decide, like California and some of the others. And I'm not a fan of some of the states like Washington and New York that have prohibited vertical integration. I think either end of the spectrum is just not an optimal structure for your industry. Either mandating vertical integration or prohibiting vertical integration doesn't make a lot of sense. In order to overcome the tax burdens and the other challenges facing cannabis industries, cannabis companies need to be able to capture the margin at multiple levels in the chain of production and distribution. And so, if you open up the market wide open and you give unlimited licenses, you run the risk of volatile markets like we've seen in California and Oregon and some other, Colorado and some others. But ultimately, you're letting the market decide the shape of your industry. And while we're going to see some ups and downs inevitably, ultimately, I think that's how it's going to have to play out. So it's hard to say any one particular state has done a great job. A lot of the early states, they didn't know. They were the laboratories that were experimenting. But I think Colorado and California have ultimately, done reasonably well from an industry structure standpoint, at least. Whereas, states like Washington and New York have just not so much.
What are your thoughts on the whole matter of the municipalities opting in or opting out and being given a certain amount of time to make a decision? And I was talking a while ago to it's actually a Binghamton alum in New Jersey, and they're trying to find a place to open a dispensary, and the process seemed to be made much more difficult by the matter of waiting for municipalities around them just outside New York City, close to where they live, to see where are we going to be able to set up shop, because the villages or the towns or the cities had not made a decision and were taking their time on deciding if they were going to opt in or opt out of the process. And so locations that they thought would be in play ultimately just wound up not panning out, and it's sort of like musical chairs to get to the site that they wanted. So what are your thoughts on the opt-in, opt-out? And it sounds like that's not really a ideal situation. And, the states that have rolled that out maybe are not the best practices of sort.
Well, it's not. And finding a location is often one of the big challenges for a cannabis company. I've seen the same thing in New Jersey, and I suspect we'll see the same thing in New York. Um, remember, there are certain geographical limitations anyway, right? You can't be too close to a school or a house of worship. Municipalities have zoning restrictions for retail or industrial establishments. You're not going to put a cannabis extraction facility in the middle of a residential neighborhood, obviously. So in New York, the legislation prohibits municipalities from imposing unreasonable zoning restrictions, because a lot of municipalities impose zoning restrictions that were essentially a ban in disguise. And so the statute prohibits that in New York. But look, as the industry develops, we've seen many localities impose what they call green zones, i.e., you can only have your cannabis business in these, within these geographic boundaries, and then those green zones get filled up, right? You don't want to have 5 dispensaries all next to each other, for example. So, that's a practical challenge. I think we're seeing that in a really nasty way in Jersey in particular. New Jersey has granted a lot of licenses now, a lot of conditional licenses, and people now need to lock down their locations, and it's a challenge in a densely populated environment.
It's a question from the chat. Neil, how did you get involved in this niche area of?
Well, it started with really one client about 8 years ago that was applying for one of the New York medical licenses, and in the process of doing that, they went over to Israel and they got a license from Tikkun Olam, which was the first legal medical marijuana company in the world, as far as we could tell. And they got an exclusive license to all of their intellectual property. And then they tried to apply in New York, but they also used that intellectual property to license that IP around the country and worldwide for pharmaceutical purposes. And working with them, I, did a few deals, met a few people, went to a couple of conferences, and I woke up one day and was like, how did cannabis become 80% of my practice? And the answer was because the industry was growing so rapidly. There was not a plethora of competent corporate lawyers. And so we developed a little bit of a reputation. We did a bunch of deals, met a few people, and it just took off on its own, and there was just no stopping it. So now we represent some of the leading cannabis companies in the country, one of the leading cultivation firms in California, investment bankers, investment funds, and companies of all types. A lot of the cannabis companies that when we first meet them, because cannabis is so capital intensive, they may have 4 or 5 or 10 facilities, each one with its own set of investors. And we're often called in to restructure the cap table, reorganize the group under a holding company that can then go out and raise investment capital or be sold. We do a lot of cleanup work for these companies, getting them into shape to access the markets. And then we've done dozens and dozens of private placement financings to raise capital privately, several IPOs, a lot of mergers and acquisitions, which has been a huge trend in the industry. More and more some secured debt transactions, as that's become a more popular way for cannabis companies to access growth capital. And the story is continuing to be written.
There's a couple of questions that have come in through the chat through 2 separate comment boxes, but they're sort of related, so I'll go ahead and read them all together. Given the relative safety of cannabinoids, isn't all of this regulation ridiculous when a physician can write a prescription for highly addictive opioids? If authorities are aware of the dubious history of cannabis in the United States, why doesn't Congress just outright reverse the antiquated laws that's more regulated than alcohol?
All right, so those are 2 separate questions. So isn't it all about the money? Yeah, for the pharmaceutical companies, yes. And, interestingly, it's been the pharmaceutical company lobby that has spent a lot of money and exerted a lot of influence opposing any congressional action to change the cannabis laws. From a physician's standpoint, writing an authorization to use medical cannabis is not quite the same thing as writing a prescription for a pharmaceutical product, because a pharmaceutical product has a known chemical composition, whereas a cannabinoid that a doctor may be permitting his patient to obtain from a medical cannabis dispensary may have a range of chemical compositions, but it's not going to be exact, as a result of which many doctors have been reluctant to authorize their patients to use cannabis because they're just not exactly sure precisely what those patients will be getting, and they're also not exactly sure what the cross indications may be, the interactions between cannabis usage and some of the prescription medications. So, for example, there are a lot of people in this country on thyroid medication. CBD may interfere with the absorption and effectiveness of thyroid medication. So you need to be careful as a doctor about things like that. And so, is it all about the money? For the pharmaceutical companies, yes. For the doctors, no, it's not all about the money. I think there are other factors involved. Why doesn't Congress just outright reverse the antiquated laws? Well, because they're on the take from the pharmaceutical companies. And also because a lot of senators and congressmen are from red states whose population is not as pro-cannabis as the blue states. We just saw yesterday, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Arkansas voters voted no on ballot proposals to legalize recreational cannabis in their states. That's the first time cannabis has been voted down, in my recollection, at the ballot box. So, on some level, these politicians are really just responding to their constituents. And also, they tend to be very conservative, old Republican white men. And, they're hostile to cannabis. So they're not inclined to vote in favor of it anyway. And they can justify their positions as being consistent with their constituents' preferences.
We'll take one more question and then we'll go ahead and start to wrap up. And thinking about the slide that we looked at toward the end of the presentation, there's a lot of room for the market to grow, but the stocks aren't really performing very well at this point. What do you feel is dragging them down? Is it just sort of the economy not doing well in general? Is it a sense of, okay, ho hum, it's cannabis, it's been out there for a while, maybe we're not as interested anymore? It's not necessarily, pun intended, the flavor of the month. Is it both? Is it neither?
Well, I tell you what, Steve, when I am able to fully understand why stocks move in particular directions, I'll be working with some of the other Binghamton University alumni that are running hedge funds and managing money, because I don't think anybody knows for sure. But I think the best guesses are several-fold. Number one, remember the cannabis industry is in a bit of a slump with price compression and thus margin compression and thus a lot of pressure on profitability. Most cannabis companies are not profitable and do not have positive cash flow. They're dependent on raising capital to keep themselves afloat, in large part because of the severe tax burdens resulting from Internal Revenue Code Section 280E, as well as the other factors, inability to achieve economies of scale, high wage rates, that just make it much more difficult for them to be profitable. And the market's recognition of that. A lot of public companies try to get investors to value them based on a multiple of their EBITDA as a proxy for their cash flow. The problem with cannabis companies is EBITDA is not really a very good proxy for cash flow because that taxes component can be enormous and it costs real cash. So I think it's a combination of all of those factors, much of the market realizing that most cannabis companies are not really making money. And for a while, they were, cannabis companies seemed to be valued based on the assumption that there would be federal legality, 280E would go away, there would be the interstate commerce and the ability to achieve economies of scale. And I think people are starting to realize that there may never be interstate commerce, even when there's federal legality, and that some discount might be appropriate to apply to the anticipated future valuations of these companies that right now are still burning cash.
Well, we're just about to the top of the hour, 1 o'clock. So I think this would be a great place to wind it down. And Neil, thank you so much for what has been a very, very informative hour. And we're very excited to be able to offer this topic again, especially because it was so well received on the initial event that we had in Westchester as an in-person panel discussion, and now able to share this information with people throughout the state in the webinar format. And so much has changed in the past 6 or 7 years. It's great to be able to bring you and bring this topic back to the table. So thank you so much for being the speaker for our program today.
Quite welcome. Thank you, Steve. My pleasure. And good luck to all the Binghamton University alumni out there who may want to get involved in the industry.
Well, we've got December coming up, and Hanukkah and Christmas, and people taking vacation time to use up what they need to for the end of the year. So we are going to take a brief hiatus in the Binghamton Learning Network webinar series, and we're going to be back in 2023 with a couple of really, really interesting programs starting in January. And so working on programming 3 topics for January and February. One is going to be financial wellness. We'll have a webinar on estate planning and another program on productivity and time management. So we'll take a brief break in December, and then we'll be ready to recharge just after the start of the new year in January. So as always, just want to thank Jen Gabriel, who is behind the scenes and keeping an eye on things for us and monitoring the chat and the comments and different things that come our way. So thank you for your assistance once again, and certainly provides valuable input along with the Lifelong Learning Committee as we assemble the topics and speakers that are all part of this webinar series. So just one more token PSA. Check out the website, binghamton.edu/alumni, to see all of the great things that we have going on. This program will be archived, and if you want to check out the recording or share it around after, it'll be on the microsite and on Facebook. So definitely help the good content get around. So for Neil Kaufman and Jen Gabriel, I'm Steve C. Prasad. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time on the Binghamton Learning Network.